Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth, the study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake lie or imagination. Now, some interesting facts were brought to me yesterday on the mind science, the science of mind and intelligence. Believe me, when I was writing my book, Transcending the Mind, and there's so many things Patanjali mentions and there are so many facts mentioned in Puranas about the mind and intelligence that makes the entire Western discovery as really small. Now, it's not about the function of the brain waves and all these things because mind has no connection to your brain, according to Patanjali. It is dependent on a past karma. So, anyway, I have very special guest today, and we are talking about my favorite topics, which is the geography of the ancient world. So let's welcome Kom Kapati. Kome Kapati.
Namaskar. Nice to see you again.
Always a pleasure. Today looking absolutely cool. So, Kom, the Sumeru and Meru, these are very like topics which are discussed in many cultures, not just India. I had a show before where I had done live show on Hindu connections to Sumeru civilization. And I was looking at the artifacts which they collected. Oftentimes they confuse Sumeru with Mesopotamia. And the same artifacts are shown for both Mesopotamia as well as Sumeru because the region is the same practically. So, what is your finding on the Sumeru and Meru before we begin with?
Well, as you know, the Sumeru is the axis mundi, the axis of the world, which connects the Earth to the sky, and therefore it is the column, the pillar, around which the world revolves, and it connects to the seven stars of the Great Bear, who are also called in Central Asia, they are called the seven Khans. In India, we talk about Saptarishi, the seven rishis, but in Central Asia, they talk about the seven Khans because the Khans are the leaders, the rulers, not the leaders, they are essentially the rulers, but also the sages. They have a divine property. So the fact is that Sumeru or Meru is often associated with the Himalayas because since in Indian history, the Himalayas are the roof of the world, as they are in a sense geographically too. Generally, there is a tendency to conflate or equate Sumeru with Mount Kailash or with another very high mountain. However, there are a number of indications in the Indian scriptures, which would show that Sumeru is much further to the north. And in fact, it's considered as the pole, right? The North Pole. And therefore, it has been placed in southern Siberia or in outer Mongolia, inner Mongolia or outer Mongolia. And in fact, there is very interesting work done over the last several decades that has identified Sumeru as the highest peak in the Altai, which is a mountain located in Mongolia and in Russian Mongolia, which has various names because the Russian part of what you might call the Altai or Mongolian region is divided into various provinces and regions, one of which is Buryatia. This is all south and east of Lake Baikal, the largest freshwater lake in the world. And it's also connected to, therefore, particularly the two regions of Russia which are called Altai, one of which is Altai Krai, and the other is Nagorno-Altai, which means the high mountains Altai. So it is in Nagorno-Altai that Sumeru is located. And several explorers have been trying to get there for the last few centuries. But most of them were not able to get there because Altai is forbidden. You cannot climb it because it is a religious, sacred symbol and area. And therefore, the local inhabitants who are still practicing what is called the shamanistic tradition, they do not let outsiders go there, and they do not themselves go there. They only approach it. They perform parikrama, but they do not climb it. And we know that this is true also of some other mountains in the Himalayan chain and in the Andes as well. Now, among the many investigators and travelers, one was Nicholas Roerich, who tried very hard to get to Sumeru, because it was one of the goals that he had set for himself, given that Sumeru is supposed to be the gateway of the kingdoms of Shambhala and Agarthi, who are the mystical kingdoms either located underground or in another dimension, in the fifth dimension, depending how you interpret the legend. And he was financed, in fact, by the Secretary of Commerce of the United States, Wallace, who became vice president and who tried to be president, who stood for election but was not successful. And Wallace, who obviously would appear to be eccentric in our days, was in fact very interested in the possibility of connecting with the hidden kingdoms of the Himalayas. And that's why he supported Roerich in his attempt. But when Roerich tried to get to Sumeru, he was apparently diverted by the local inhabitants, who told him to look for a mountain called Belukha, which is not far, but which is not Sumeru. So Roerich came to Belukha, and from what I understand, he never realized that he had not gone to the real Sumeru. Now, the real Sumeru has some interesting geographical characteristics and topographical characteristics, because at the top there are three peaks which are equated to the Trimurti. And on the one between these three peaks, there are five circles, and very large circles, which you can see from many miles away. And apparently those circles, we don't know if they are natural or they were drawn by somebody, but they are regarded as the chakras. You know, they are part of the chakras of the spine of the world, which is in fact Sumeru. Now, all that may appear very exotic, but there is a lot of, even in relatively modern days, which means in the early 20th century, there were lots of competing claims to that region, because it was seen as the key to attaining world power. And even the Russian communists, some of them were indeed very attracted to this, what you might call mythology, and you would call it Sattology. And there is a book called Red Shambhala, which is most interesting, and which shows how early communists in the 1920s, some of them were trying to find the hidden kingdom of Shambhala, because they thought that if they could make the perfect communist man, he would have to be like a bodhisattva. And therefore, that fusion between the bodhisattva ideal and the communist man was the dream of some of them. And on the other side of the political spectrum, you had some what we now might call right-wing idealists, particularly Baron Ungern von Sternberg, who left during the Bolshevik Revolution. He left towards the east. He reached Mongolia, and he put under his protection the head Lama of Mongolia, the Hutuktu, or the Khambo Lama, as he is called, in Urga, which is now Ulaanbaatar. And he made himself the commander of Mongolia, and he wanted to make it a tantric kingdom, which would be the basis for the reconquest of Russia as an opponent of communism. So he opposed the swastika to the communists' hammer and sickle. And his flag carried indeed the swastika, which was a symbol of Shambhala. And interestingly, you could see that maybe 20 years later, Hitler seems to have used a similar symbology, because he also raised the swastika and very quickly declared that his goal was to oppose communism. So you can see the affiliation of that whole ideological struggle in a way. But anyway, back to Sumeru. I was recently at a lecture by Professor Variku, who is the president and founder of the Indian Himalayan Institute and Foundation. And the Indian Himalaya Foundation publishes a magazine for the last 27 years, very regularly. And that magazine has a wealth of information on all aspects of Central Asia, all the way from the Caspian Sea Kashyapa, the Lake of Kashyapa, to eastern China, Western China rather, and all the way from Kashmir and Himachal up to eastern Siberia. So there is a sort of a unity in that region in terms of ethnic and cultural connections, because what is called shamanism in those regions of eastern Siberia is in fact a mixture of the ancient tradition, which could be regarded as a Hindu tradition or even a Vedic tradition, because they perform fire sacrifices and a number of other sacrifices that are defined in the Vedas. But they have also accepted Buddhism many thousands of years later. So it's a mixture of what we could call Hinduism in the shamanistic version, or Vedism if you prefer, and Buddhism, Tantric Mahayana Buddhism. And of course, they are very close to the Tibetans. In fact, the Dalai Lama himself is Mongol in origin. So you can see that that whole region conserves this great tradition, and it is most likely that the mentions of Sumeru in Indian legends, Itihasas and Kavyas, and not to mention the Puranas, are indeed connected to what is now Transbaikalia. And it's very interesting that among the various sources that you can find nowadays, there are references to, for example, you can retrace the travels of Arjuna, one of the 5 Pandavas, when he went on a Digvijaya Yatra, and he went north because the north was allotted to him. The 3 other brothers went in the 3 other directions, and of course Yudhishthira, as the king of Dharma, stayed in the middle in Indraprastha. And Arjuna went north, and you can follow pretty much his itinerary, because you find traces of the populations that he visited and which are still there in many ways, even though sometimes their names have changed, but sometimes their names have not even changed. They are still pretty much the same. And going through these various regions, which we can now retrace through places like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia, we find that at the end of his journey, he reached Uttarakurus. And there he was stopped by the people, in fact, it's called the Hari Varsha. And there he was stopped by some very tall, white-skinned people who told him that you have reached the point beyond which you cannot go because this is sacred land. And he said, I have come to ask tributes from you for my brother, who is going to perform Rajasuya. And they gave him very lavish tributes. And upon receiving that, he went back and brought the tributes to Indraprastha. So the question is clearly that he was stopped before he could reach Sumeru. And that shows the antiquity of a tradition which has kept Sumeru as an inviolate place, as a forbidden place, but very connected to India ritually, culturally, and historically. And we all know that so-called Indo-European populations lived in that whole region, which includes now the Xinjiang region of China, which means the Tarim Basin. This was all populated by either Indo-European or highly Indo-Europeanized population, which spoke Prakrits. And the most famous are probably the Tokharians. So we know that there was a sort of a cultural unity all the way there, through Kucha and the various other regions, the various other towns in that whole Kashgar and Khotan. And later on, of course, there was an influx of Turkic people, which pretty much replaced largely the earlier inhabitants. But the traditions in great part remained, even though, of course, there are these successive layers, and you can see the great bodies, because they're actually very tall people, these Tokharians who are buried in these tombs with a lot of ornaments. And they seem to be, many of them are red or blonde haired, very tall. And some of them have been called the queen or the princesses, women among them, because they are particularly beautiful. So you can see the trace of these Tokharians, who seem to have been precisely the kind of people that Arjuna is said to have met when he got all the way there. So that gives us a sort of a continuity between the ancient epics and more recent archaeological and ethnographic findings.
What an amazing start of this show, actually. So I wrote a book, The Famous Five, in which I geographically pointed the entire travel of the four brothers. Yudhishthira was staying in Hastinapur during that time, because Indraprastha was not made yet, because the taxes had not come back. So one of the things which you really mentioned to me was shamanic traditions. Now Europeans refer to as shaman, but we refer to as Vedic in many ways, because shaman is kind of pejorative word, the way Europeans use it against South Americans and other places. Now, one really interesting thing which you said was there are still people. Actually, this is on my top list to visit one of these days, Mongolia, and go to that place. So there is a mountain which is Khan Tegri, and Mongolian, if you wanted to say sheep, it's called Khan. Like the pronunciation is Khan. Khan means sheep. Sheep Tegri, Khan Tegri means, and you very interestingly said 7 Khans, 7 stars, because the 7 stars remain constant on that top, constant over there. And that place is considered very sacred according to, and I'm going to put a perspective of Mahabharata only over there, Mahabharata, and as well as Ramayana, because Ramayana also considered as a sacred place. And that place is called where in the Revatak mountain, which is in Junagadh today, Gujarat, that peak of that mountain was brought for, Krishna had brought it back over there. And then you correctly mentioned the path of Arjun right till the top. He goes there, and there's a nadi called Sardyaj, which flows from that mountain. Today, in Mahabharata, it's called Shadoba, and Ramayana is called Shaloba Nadi. And like very specific. So tell me more about if you have studied that, the people and the kind of worship that they do over there, because I was told that in Mongolia, that place is so sacred that there are Mongolian armed polices and the armies don't allow anyone to go near that place. They say people will go crazy, like something like that. They say that no mountain expeditions are allowed, and which is in line with the thought that that place is still frequented significantly by people from other planets. And last time we did a show on the UFOs, and I was telling you that from that point to Tibet and Kailash, it's a very frequent air path for many of the people, which the Americans call UFOs, but we know they are vimanas of different devatas and good people, not bad people. They come there regularly because that's their point of connection with Earth. So do the people over there consider this as a central point of Earth as well?
Back to what you were saying about shamans, as you know, shaman is probably rooted in a Sanskrit word. And Ananda Kumaraswamy, in his book Hinduism and Buddhism, pointed out the etymology which is ascribed to shaman, which comes from Shamayitri in the Rig Veda, which means the one who pacifies. In other words, he pacifies the elements. And by that tool, he becomes their master. So clearly, shaman is, in fact, the oldest religions. There are proofs of shamanism being practiced 500,000 years ago, which means that it predates Homo sapiens sapiens. If we subscribe to the theory of Homo sapiens sapiens having emerged 100 and some thousand years ago in Africa, which I don't think is necessarily true. But anyway, that seems to be the current theory. So in any event, shamanism is the original religion. And by its deep links with shamanism, Vedism is also the oldest religion, even though you find shamanism in most ancient traditions, whether it's in China, Taoism is rooted in shamanism. Japan, where Shinto is rooted in shamanism, and you can go on and describe, find a form of shamanism. Even today, Korea, which has become almost a majority Christian nation, South Korea, it still practices a form of shamanism. Most people mix Christianity and shamanism, and of course, the Buddhists do even more so. But so back to what you were saying, remember what we're talking about here, if you talk of Mount Belukha and Mount Sumeru, they are actually in Russia. They are in the Trans-Baikal region, which was annexed by Russia in the late 18th century. And of course, culturally and ethnically, it is Mongol. But the inhabitants, who are rather Russified because they speak Russian, and school is teaching is conducted in Russia. But interestingly, a lot of Christian Russians have also taken up the task of protecting that region and making sure that no one comes in. And since they have a regional autonomy, because the population is mixed, there are Russian settlers, there are also old believers, the Raskolniki, who are the old Christian believers who essentially try to go back to original Christianity from the days of Jesus Christ himself. And these Raskolniki are generally in very good relations with the shamans because they share a lot of things with them, and they have no, liturgical or faith-based divergences. So it's very interesting that the Raskolniki of Russia, who were persecuted in the 18th century when Peter the Great decided to modernize Orthodox Christianity, so they had to flee to remote places. And one of the places they went to was Transbaikalia, and they keep there their traditions with their so-called primitive churches, etc. But anyway, so the fact is that that region is protected by its inhabitants, and the local state runs a security force on horseback, which actually watches and makes sure that if any expedition or any pilgrim goes there, they stop them and say, where are you going? You cannot go any further. And in fact, it's interesting that Professor Varikou went some years ago in a pilgrimage to that region, and he wanted to perform a fire sacrifice. So he basically was stopped by, he and his companions who were Russians. One of them was a shaman, but the others were Russians. And he was stopped by one of those mounted guardsmen. And when he knew that he was an Indian and he wanted to perform a fire sacrifice, a yagna, then he said, okay, you can go ahead, but not beyond that point, because you cannot actually climb to the top. So it shows you how much they are aware of the community of tradition between India and that very region, which is actually true of all Mongolia. Mongolia has a very deep link with India, and they regard themselves as closer to India than to China, even though China is right at their border. In fact, most Mongolian kings claim descent from Indian kings. They say that one of the kings, who was the king of Kangra, went there and established a kingdom, and his son inherited it, and therefore they do see themselves as part of that royal Indian family. So this is something you find in Korea too, where you have the kings were descended from a princess from the blood of Sri Ram, and even today they say that about 15% Koreans can trace their descent to that princess and her husband. So that means there were lots of Koreans do have Indian blood, if you go by that tradition. So anyway, this shows you that these traditions have remained strong despite 70 years of communism and 1 century, at least 2 centuries before that, of Christianity. So obviously, it's a very interesting thing to reconnect the links, to reconnect the two communities. And Professor Varikou is very keen to promote religious tourism from those people to India to visit Bodh Gaya and Sarnath and the other sacred places, which they very much would like to see. But of course, they generally are poor people. They have very few means. And so you need for that to provide some inexpensive flights, maybe some charter flights, and perhaps the Indian government could sponsor some of those yatras, So this shows you that this connection can be revived and should be revived. I see you are showing a map, and I think you can see Tengri. Now, Tengri is the sky. It's called, Tengri is the god of sky, and he's called that way in all these places, including Kazakhstan. I think Tengri is a Turkic name, by the way. And there is also an interesting connection between the word Khan, which is used for the Lord, the chief, and the Jewish name Kohen, which is the name of a tribe. The Kohens are the priests, the priestly tribe. And many say that the Jews who came from the Khazar community, who converted to Judaism, they turned Khan into Kohen. which is in fact a form of pronunciation. So that you can always dispute, but it's one theory at least.
The funny thing is that in that I was checking on the maps actually, just to show that how it is connected. You are absolutely right that it has more Russian control because it's on the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, as well as Mongolia, westernmost part of Mongolia. The Mongolian population, like if you look at their culture and everything, it's so deeply non-Christian and it's almost look like a Hindu population, almost in terms of belief and their fire sacrifice, which is a common thing which is said in Vedas, that the fire never extinguishes on that mountain. And I was looking at three tribes over there during my research. All the three tribes, their beginning prayer starts with Om, all three, which are living at the base over there, completely at the base. And names are very difficult to pronounce on the show, but I don't want to kill it, but I'll keep it that way. It's in my book as well. So one question comes in that the Mongolian government, you absolutely said correctly that the most of the Mongolian government is very friendly towards India culturally. Politically, I don't know, but culturally, yes. So what is the influence of like the Sumeru, which is mentioned as a, like you said, and Bhagavad Puran says that it's a central point for the 14 planetary systems, and it's like a pillar where all the planets and everyone revolves around it. And the Sumeru mountain extends multiple lokas according to Vedic writings. The Mount Meru on Earth is considered a central point in terms of everything that you say. So when you calculate any type of timelines, then the line drawn from Mount Meru to which is Altai. Altai is a mountain range, and we're talking about the peak here at Khantegri, the highest peak in that area. And if you look at the straight line coming to 00, which is Lanka, according to Surya Siddhanta, which goes all the way, not the Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was called Simhaladweep, according to Vedas. So my question is, like in your research and in the Himalayan body, which you referred also, what are the things that they cover in terms of eating habits, culture, food, process of worship, method of worship? Do you think all those things are also recorded there, which is similar to the Vedic one? Because I also heard that those populations living at the base are very vegetarian because shamanism promotes Vedic food eating habits.
Human food nutrition is highly dependent on the environment. So there are many areas where vegetarianism is not practical, and that is true of Tibetans and Mongols in large part. Some may practice vegetarianism, but it is not regarded as compulsory. And in fact, as you know, the Buddha himself had a very ambiguous attitude to vegetarianism, and many hold him to have been a non-vegetarian. Be that as it may, the fact is that the influence of Buddhism is so strong in that whole region, and here we are talking both about independent Mongolia as well as Russian Mongolia, which is where Mount Meru is supposed to be located, and of course Inner Mongolia, which is Chinese. But let's not forget that the Mongols are very close to the Chinese emperors right from the days of the Yuan dynasty, which was founded by Mongols, by descendants of Genghis Khan. And then further on, the last ruling dynasty of China, the Qing, they had grand priests who were Mongols and who performed for them the tantric rituals and the tantric prayers during their coronation. So that is pervasive, and therefore when you say Om, obviously all the Mongols will recite Om Mani Padma Hum, and they will put up the various symbols of Buddhism, including the shortens or stupas, which are often related to the older kurgans. The kurgans used to be funeral mounds, and even today the great lamas are buried in these mounds, which are shortened. And very often they find that these lamas are found centuries later intact. Their bodies haven't decayed. Partly, they say, because of their tantric power, but also because obviously the cold and other conditions. But anyway, the fact is that this is a well-known spiritual anchor of the Mongolian culture, in the sense that one worships the eternally preserved bodies of the great lamas. And from that point of view, you can see that the connection between Mongolia and Tibet is intimate. And of course, we all know that Tibet was a child of Nalanda, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to put it. So that tradition of northern India, not only in northern India, but primarily in what is now Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and West Bengal, has been spread to Tibet, and then through Tibet to Central Asia, all the way to southern Siberia.
You know, in Bhagavad Puran, if I quote Bhagavad Puran, in which the Buddha is mentioned to have come down to prevent misuse of Vedas for animal sacrifice. That's what he come down. So the original accounts, or the oldest accounts of Buddha, proclaim him to be pro non-violence against animals, to be used for any type of sacrifice. Because in Vedas, animal sacrifice is forbidden in all the Vedas, mentioned by many saints actually. Ramanujacharya said it, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said it. But most of the sacrifices are mentioned which are not related to people who are actually following spiritual process. Now, coming to the this location, now we were talking about this place in Mongolia. In that, there is another point which comes in if you research properly in the Vedic references only, the Vyasadeva is supposed to be doing his tapasya at the Meru Parvat. And then he sends his son Shukdev, who was born there, down, because it was all considered part of Bharat, the larger Bharat. And he comes down and he traces now Shukdev also passes the same path like other places, like the Meru Varsh, then Harivarsh, Hemavanta, which is the Tibet area, completely Central Asia, Tibet area, and then Bharatvarsh, then Himalayas, and then Bharatvarsh, which is Aryavrat. This is the 4 regions he crosses by walking. And then he comes to Mithila. Mithila, he wanted to meet Janak. Very accurately mentioned. So the one path was taken by Arjun, which went north for the Rajasuya Yajna. Another path, which is and Arjun went twice or thrice, because the second time he went after the war, when they did.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to, which was the proper Digvijay, because once they had conquered the Kauravas, then they wanted to establish the kingdom from Indraprasth.
Yeah. So that was the second, after the Mahabharata war. Also, he went there to collect the taxes. And the first one was obviously a victory. Rajasuya Yajna was a victory one. The second part was just to ensure that the territories are still under the control of Indraprasth and Hastinapur, twin capitals. So what is the reference which you find in the modern text about the Khan Tegri and the connection of that region to the Eastern European side, because they are also connected over there, because Almaty and all the way east is also following the same path. In Lithuania, I found references of great saint and warrior visiting thousands of years back from Meru side. So I thought that is because Arjun's travel was circular. It went north and then came all the way and to the west of Caspian Sea, and then came back to Sindhu Desh, and then came to Hastinapur.
The Balts, especially the Lithuanians, are speak one of the languages closest to Sanskrit etymologically. So they are a very ancient colony, if you want to call it that way. They'll say they are a very ancient settlement of what we call, for lack of a better name, the Indo-Europeans. And this was well known even in the 19th century by ethnologists and linguists who specialize in the Baltic states. And that's precisely why Rorik who came from the Baltic area. He was his family property was in what was at that point called the Baltic provinces of Russia. In fact, he had a family home there called Ishvara. And he, of course, felt deeply attracted to Tibet because he was convinced that this was the original home of his ancestors. And you have another well-known Balt philosopher and traveler, Count Hermann Kaiserling, who traveled extensively in India and in other parts of the world, and who also was very aware of the connection of his homeland, Kovno, which is now Kaunas, with the what you might call the Indo-Tibetan culture. This being said, I would like to point that you quoted some very late sources like Ramanujacharya, which was the full age of Vedanta when vegetarianism had become, the primary injunction. But if you look at the Vedas, you have to account for the Ashwamedha and even the Gogna, which is the name given to the sacrificer, and Gogna etymologically means he who sacrifices go, the cow. So clearly the original sacrifice was turned into a symbolic ritual, and there was no more bloodshed. But you have to probably look back at the origins, which almost certainly were based on blood sacrifice, because most religions, including shamanism, did practice some sort of blood ritual for atonement and as a sort of a cleansing, and also to justify the fact that sometimes you had to kill animals to eat because it was not always easy to live only from vegetables. Unless you cultivated them, which was not always an option. So then you had to find food wherever it was. And especially, remember the Kshatriyas, they were always supposed to eat meat because they were supposed to be strong and fight. So clearly, full vegetarianism was not a universal requirement. And, in a way, when you have a warlike culture, it's very illogical to assume that they were vegetarian, because if you are preparing to kill people and ready to do it, you probably don't have a problem killing animals, and you may even want to do it because it will make you stronger and more inured to the sight of blood. Vegetarians can be, in fact, mild and have trouble fighting because of their own aversion to bloodshedding.
No, the vegetarians are often the most violent people in the world. If you see the fighting skills of vegetarians, like they're oftentimes the most in terms of they can put a lot of violence. So, I will quote only what is written over there. I don't know more than that. So if you look at the Vyasadeva, he wrote the Veda, and multiple places he is preferring to eat only. Like all the places, he's preferring to eat only what is kandamul ahar, which is roots and fruits and vegetables thing. His disciples who wrote the Vedas, according to on his direction, he divided them, and his disciples wrote. All of them were also. So I'm talking about very high level spiritual people. We are not talking about some general principle at the top, not at the maybe people who living on the land or something they might be eating, but generally on the top it's like that. Like in the Ashwamedha Yajna also, if you look at the multiple references which are there in Ramayana and other places also, where the animal is sacrificed, brought back to life through mantra, or supposedly assured a human life immediately, and the meat is kept on a tree, bale tree, so that other animals or anyone can eat. They don't know what will happen to that thing. Now, coming to that will divert our topic. So I will come back to the topic we're discussing today. So in that place, if I look at the Bhagavad Puran references, Mahabharata references, Ramayana because this place is common in all the scriptures of Vedas, and most of the advanced sages are doing tapasya there. Most of them. And then they come down to Bharat all the time. So it's a very frequent path of travel. And one interesting thing is told to Shukdev is that Shukdev is the son of Vyasadeva. He says that don't travel by air through your yoga shakti. Go on land, walking. But when going back, he goes by air to Meru.
Yeah.
Because most of the people say, according to Vedas, that beyond Himalayas, you go to Meru before you go ascend to the Brahmaloka. That means Meru is the point where you can access straight the Brahmaloka top, and that's where he goes to go to the Surya Loka. So these references are there, very striking. So in the cultures of that land, in those areas, do you think, or does this Himalayan body that you have said, I would love to meet that, bring that gentleman on the show also, if you are connected to him. Where do you think that these people, they actually know the importance of Meru Parvat in the Vedic civilization?
I don't know about the locals who have never gone out of their area, but the people who have a broader education, they certainly do know, and the Russians who are interested in the subject are very aware of it. In fact, most of the Russians who practice yoga and follow some Hindu or Buddhist practices, they are quite aware of the connection of that particular part of their territory, the Trans-Baikal region, with India, because as you know, Baikal itself, the lake, is supposed to be a very sacred place. And some people go there and do retreats alone in the forest on the shore of the lake in a little isba, in a little cabin, and try to essentially survive among the very harsh nature of that very beautiful but very harsh nature. So clearly that tradition is alive, and of course at the local level, people do know. I mean, they do practice a certain mixture of shamanism and Buddhism. After all, tantric Himalayan Buddhism is very strongly marked by shamanism, and therefore there is no contradiction between the two. But there is no doubt either that greater awareness of India can be spread among them if some more interaction is arranged. You know, in some other regions of Russia, the lamas are trained in dharamshala because they have to find there the real teachings. And so I would assume that in the other, for example, in the Republic of Kalmykia, which is far away between the Caspian and the Black Sea, but in the other three republics of Russia, which are Buddhist, majority population is Buddhist, Tuva and the Yakutia, and these regions obviously have very few contacts with India. In fact, in our conference on Dharma Dhamma, which will take place from 3rd to 5th of March in Bhopal, we have invited the Khambo Lama of Transbaikalia, who is the leader, the head of all the Buddhists. In fact, he's the head of all the Buddhists of Russia, you might say. So that is, of course, one step to bring the two traditions closer, even though the top lamas, they probably have come to India before, but not the average person over there.
Thank you. Thank you, Kom, because I think we can go on and on this topic, because I have so much of material here on this topic. And I'm so glad that you touched this topic, actually. And for the viewers, I must tell you, this was suggestion by Kom himself. And I love the fact that you like to trace origins. Most of the Indians don't do that. And one thing which I really I have objected in one of my books also, Indo-European, because it is, even though most of the European stock has Indian genes, so reverse iron invasion theory is true, because of the quality of the hair, because that's what the anthropologists calculate. The quality of the hair of Indians and Europeans is the same. Both have thin hairs, and generally the skull structure is also the same, most of Europeans and Indians. So Indo-European is a European-centric word, but generally, if you want to say, it can be just a large territory of one type of grouping. Anthropologists may put different names. So thank you so much, Kom. Again, you touched a very, very important topic. And we will continue this discussion. Maybe we'll go to some other countries, because I'm very much interested in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and the spiritual traditions of those countries, which are phenomenally close to the Vedic culture. Thank you and namaste.
Namaskar. Thank you.